She almost made it to the weekend. Saturday came and went in the quiet, deliberate way she'd been constructing her days. The medication at 8 in the morning, with food she'd cooked herself, because there was something necessary about cooking, about the discipline of putting heat to raw things and making them nourishing. A call with Gemma, the blood oranges from the market, eaten standing at the kitchen window, watching the harbor. She cleaned the apartment, not because it needed it, but because her hands needed occupation. She read. She slept in fragments, each one clean and dreamless. The dark thing that was watching her, apparently content to wait. Sunday arrived with fog and a low-pressure system moving in off the Atlantic, the kind that turned Blackthorn Cove the color of old pewter and made the harbor sound closer than it was, the buoys ringing in the swell. She liked this weather, had always liked it, the compression of it, the way fog simplified the visible world to the immediately proximate. Everything beyond 20 feet dissolved to suggestion. You could not, in fog like this, worry about the horizon. She was managing. That was the word she used internally. The status report she gave herself each morning in the bathroom mirror over the business of the silver strands, which were 4 now, 5, spreading from the left temple in a gradient that was almost intentional in its geometry. Managing. Not fine, not okay, not any of the words that were asked about and expected and contained lies. Just managing. Upright and functional and in motion, which was all she'd ever asked of herself, and which was, she decided, sufficient. She was managing right up until Sunday evening, when the cold in her chest stopped being a tide and became a wall. It came without warning. No crescendo, no escalation from the usual slow-moving chill. It simply arrived, absolute and total, as if someone had reached inside her sternum and replaced her heart with a block of ice the exact size and shape of her heart, but with none of its properties. She was in the kitchen. She had been making tea. She heard the kettle beginning to sing, and then she heard nothing, because the cold moved upward along her spine in a single convulsive wave and took everything above it. She went down. Not gracefully. There was nothing graceful in it. Her knees hit the kitchen floor, and her shoulder caught the counter edge on the way, and she was on her hands and knees on the linoleum. Her vision going silver at the edges, her breath coming in short, inadequate pulls that brought cold air in, but returned nothing warm. She tried to call out. The word she wanted was Gemma's name, a reflex of connection. Even though Gemma was 30 minutes away, and her phone was on the counter above her, and she was on the floor, and her hands were no longer the hands she recognized. They were translucent. She lifted her right hand and looked at it, and looked through it. The linoleum pattern was visible beneath her palm. She could see the grain of the floor through the structure of her own hand, the bones, faint and silver-lit beneath skin that was becoming something between solid and vapor. And she had time for exactly one thought that was not terror. So this is how it starts. And then the kitchen ceased to exist. The crossing was not a transition. It was a subtraction. Everything that composed the world she knew, the weight, the warmth, the friction of air against skin, the accumulated background noise of a living city, was simply removed. The way a hand swept across a surface clears it entirely. She was not transported. She was not pulled or pushed or guided. She was just in one place, and then not in that place. And the place she was instead of it was so comprehensively different that comparison felt like a category error. Like the inside of a held breath. Like a place that had been dark so long it had made something of the dark. Like standing in the space between two heartbeats, and discovering there was a country there. The ground beneath her was stone, black stone, smooth and cold and wet with something that was not water but behaved like it. A thin film that caught the light from a source she couldn't locate and gave it back violet and silver. The air, if it was air, had the pressure of great depth, the stillness of spaces that had never been disturbed by breath. Above her was no sky. Above her was height, an enormity of vertical space that went up beyond visible limit. And in the darkness of it, things moved. The drifting shapes she'd glimpsed before, slow and numerous, the dead in their transit. The accumulated traffic of every mortal departure routed through this place on its way to whatever came after. She was standing. She had been on her hands and knees on her kitchen floor, and now she was standing, upright without effort. And the silver haze at the edges of her vision was gone. She looked at her hands, solid, pale, luminous, with a faint silver quality to the skin that was new. She filed it away to examine later, when later was available. She breathed. Cold in, cold out. Identical. But it didn't hurt. That was the thing. That was what she noticed first and held onto. The cold here wasn't damage. In the living world, it was a deterioration, an evidence of failing, a creeping intrusion that belonged in the wrong territory. Here, it was simply climate. She was the right temperature for the place she was in. She was calibrated. That was more frightening than anything else. The dead moved past her and did not notice her. She stood very still and watched them, shapes in various states of coherence, some nearly solid, some so diffuse they were more impression than form. All of them moving with the same directionless drift she'd always seen at the periphery. Here, at their source, they were almost beautiful. In the collective motion that had no leader and no plan, and somehow described something. She was not moving with them. She was the only thing in this space that was not moving, which meant she was the only thing in this space that did not belong to its logic. And she became aware, with a slowness that had its own kind of mercy, that she was being watched. She did not turn immediately. She stood very still and felt the attention settle on her from some point behind and to the left. The kind of attention that had learned to make itself precise because its natural scale was too large. She felt it the way you felt barometric pressure change, in the body first, before the mind named it. A shift in the weight of the air, a deepening of the cold, not more extreme, but more intentional. The difference between weather and will. She turned. He was further away than she expected, 30 feet, perhaps, standing in the open dark the way structures stood, not as a feature of the landscape, but as a thing that had arrived from outside it and become, through sheer authority of presence, the most significant fact in any space it occupied. Tall. She had known that from the fog, from the prep room dark, from the dreams. She had not understood what tall meant here, in a place without the usual spatial references, where the ceiling was invisible and the floor was borderless stone. He was tall the way certain geological features were tall, not in comparison to other things, but as an absolute quality, as if height were one of his primary properties rather than a measurement. He was made of shadow. That was the only true statement about his appearance that the living world had given her, and it was accurate. But it collapsed everything interesting into a single inadequate description. He was not simply dark. He was the source of it. Or rather, he was the thing that dark organized around, the way iron filings organized around a magnetic field. The shadows at his edges moved. Not with wind, with intent, or something so close to intent that the distinction didn't matter. They shifted and reformed continuously, suggesting and withdrawing. The line of a shoulder, the geometry of a hand, the shape of a face shown for a fraction of a second and then covered again, as if showing her too much too quickly would break something. She could see his eyes. They were the one thing that held still. Voids. That was the word she'd heard in dreams, and it was not a poetic choice, it was a description. His eyes were the color of the absence of everything, and in the center of each, buried at a depth she could not calculate, pinpoints of light that burned cold and steady, like stars at the bottom of a very clear lake. He was looking at her with those eyes. Not with curiosity, not with hunger, not with the patient, circular attention of something waiting for an inevitability. He was looking at her the way she imagined you looked at something impossible, something that violated the structure of the world you'd been operating in long enough to have stopped expecting violations. He was looking at her as if she could not exist, as if she was existing anyway. She moved first. She thought, afterward, about why she did this, why she moved towards something that occupied the absolute apex of every reasonable register of threat, in a place that was not the living world, with no weapon and no plan, and 6 to 9 months of remaining life dissolving under the specific conditions of whatever was happening to her body on the kitchen floor. She moved toward him, and she did not have an answer for it that satisfied her. Only the cold in her chest, which had been pulling in a direction for weeks, and which now, finally, had a direction it could name. He went still when she started moving. A complete, absolute stillness. Even the shadows at his edges paused. Which was remarkable, which she noted with the forensic part of her brain that kept functioning regardless of circumstances, because nothing in this place was still. Everything drifted. Everything was in motion. Even the stone seemed to breathe with some slow geological rhythm. But he went utterly motionless. And the motionlessness was not calm. It was the stillness of something that had been operating by rules so old they had become structural, and had just encountered something those rules didn't account for. She kept walking. At 20 feet, she could see the shift in his shadows more clearly, not receding exactly, but assembling, drawing into greater coherence, as if her proximity was solidifying him. At 15 feet, she could feel the cold of him as a distinct thing separate from the ambient cold of the realm, concentrated and specific, pressed against her skin like a second climate. At 10 feet, the pinpoints in his eyes moved, not tracking her. They'd been tracking her from the moment she turned. Something else, something internal. She stopped at 7 feet. They looked at each other. She thought, absurdly, of the first time she'd stood at the edge of the ocean at night. 8 years old, her mother a warm presence behind her, the water invisible but audible and immense and completely without any reference point she could use. The feeling of something that had no edges, the feeling of being the smallest closed thing in the presence of the largest open one.
You were in my prep room and in the fog, and you've been in my head for weeks.
He said nothing. The shadows moved.
You took Marina Voss. I watched you.
Something in the void of his eyes shifted. Not surprise. She had the strong impression surprise was not a state he accessed easily. More like the adjustment of a very precise instrument to a new data point.
You see.
It was the first time she heard his voice, and she had not been prepared for it. She'd imagined, in the half-formed way you imagined things you knew were coming, something cold, something distant, something that would have the quality of the whispers she'd been hearing, formless and below language. His voice was none of those things. It was low and even and had the texture of stone, old stone, worn smooth by long exposure to something relentless, all the rough edges gone. It occupied space the way bodies occupied space, rather than the way sounds did. She felt it in her sternum.
Yes, I always have, since I was a child. Is that why you've been watching me?
He looked at her for a moment that had no time in it, the way this place had no weather.
You are the first living soul who has walked this ground without being carried. In a very long time.
How long?
Longer than you have context for.
That should have been cold comfort. Somehow it wasn't.
I'm dying. The shadow sickness. 6 months, maybe less, if tonight is representative.
He had gone still again, differently this time. Not the stillness of disrupted rules, the stillness of very close attention. And she had the distinct and inexplicable impression that he already knew, that he had known longer than she had.
I know.
Were you watching me because of that? Because I'm almost yours anyway?
Something happened in the shadows at his edges, a ripple that wasn't wind.
No.
She looked at him, at the void eyes with their cold starlight, at the assembled dark of him, the beauty of it that she was only now permitting herself to register, the way you permitted yourself to register an enormous view, all at once after you'd stopped trying to take it in incrementally. She had not meant to reach out. That was the truth of it, the version she would hold on to. She had not planned it, had not decided it. Her hand simply moved, as hands sometimes moved toward things that pulled at them before the mind had articulated the pull. She raised her right hand between them and extended it toward him, palm up, fingers open. The oldest gesture in the human lexicon. The one that predated language and meant the same thing in every culture and every era. Here. This is what I have. I am not hiding it. He looked at her hand. She watched something move across the assembled darkness of his features, something she had no name for, because it was a face she had not yet learned to read. A language of expression built over millennia in a world that was not hers. But she thought it contained, in some measure she could feel rather than see, shock.
Don't.
She kept her hand extended.
Living things that touch me, they do not remain living.
He stopped. The shadows at his edges contracted, then expanded, a breath he perhaps didn't know he took.
I've been touching dead things my whole life. And I'm still here.
That is not the same.
I know it's not. I know it's different. But I'm here. And I'm touching things in a world where living people don't walk. And you've been putting your attention on me for weeks, which means you already know I'm not standard.
She held his gaze, those void eyes, those cold stars in their depths.
So I'm asking you to look at my hand and tell me honestly, are you actually afraid to find out?
The silence that followed was the longest she'd stood in. Then he moved. He reached for her with the slowness of something that knew the weight of what it was doing, with deliberation so complete it was almost ceremonial. The hand extending toward hers, she saw the elegance of it, the length of the fingers, the way the shadows traced the geometry of his hand as if drawing it and withdrawing simultaneously. She saw the places where solid became something else at the edges. She saw, clearly, that he expected what he said, that the touch would be terminal, that it always was, that he had simply never encountered anything he wanted to test the rule against. His fingertips met her palm. The world broke in half. It was not pain. What it was resisted every category she had. Not pain, not pleasure, not temperature, not pressure. It was all of those simultaneously, and also the negative of all of them. A paradox experienced in the body rather than the mind. Every nerve she had firing in a language she'd never learned and somehow already knew. She felt him like weather, like a storm that had found its way inside the structural barriers and was moving through every room. She felt the cold of him, and under it, buried so deep that naming it felt like excavation, something else. Something old and agonized and wanting. A note held so long it had become part of the silence. His hand jerked back. She had not let go. She held. He looked at her, looked at their joined hands, at the place where her living warmth met his ancient cold, and neither annihilated the other. And the expression that moved across his features then was the closest thing to naked she had ever seen anything. He was undone by it. She felt it, the enormity of it, the centuries of absolute isolation suddenly interrupted by the fact of her hand, by skin meeting skin and surviving. She felt it move through him the way the cold had always moved through her, wave after wave, except what was moving through him was not cold at all, but its exact opposite, the internal equivalent of a warming thing. And it was devastating him with the precision of something that had been waiting a very long time to be felt. She held his hand. He held hers. The dead drifted around them, oblivious in their long, slow transit. And then her body, her physical body, still on the kitchen floor of a third-floor apartment in Blackthorn Cove, ran out of what it needed to maintain this crossing. She felt it the way you felt a current change direction. Suddenly, completely, without appeal. She was pulled. She had time to see his face fully, had time to see it solidify into something she would carry back with her across the membrane, something she would close her eyes and find still waiting. Sharp bones, midnight hair pushed back from a face that was beautiful in the way certain weapons were beautiful, in the way precision was beautiful. And the void eyes, locked on hers with an intensity she had no word for, because the word hadn't been invented by anyone who had survived the experience of it. She was back on the kitchen floor. Linoleum, the smell of bleach and old building and her own cold sweat, her cheek against the ground. The kettle had long since screamed itself out. Outside the window, the fog sat on the harbor, and the buoys rang in the dark, and Blackthorn Cove continued its patient coastal existence without modification. She lay there and breathed. In, out. Warm air returned. Her right hand was tingling, not pain, the specific physical memory of contact, the ghost of something that had been held, still recording its own presence. She curled her fingers around it. On the kitchen floor, in the dark of Sunday evening, Noelle Storm held the memory of that hand, and understood, with the total, irrevocable clarity of someone who has just crossed a threshold they cannot uncross, that everything that came next was going to be different. She just didn't know yet whether different was the same as worse. She had a feeling, settled cold in her chest, small, bright point of something beneath it, that it wasn't.